Welcome back to our 1025 ministry. Very glad to have you all here. Just getting into our passage even this evening as we find ourselves in Ephesians chapter 6. We'll be in verses 1 through 9, and really this is submission continued. We looked at even chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, which talks about submission in marriage. And that was kicked off by even in verse 21 of chapter 5, where it says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And Paul then gives examples of that, found in marriage, found in family, and then also found in the workplace. And so it's interesting, if you look at this pattern, there's two categories. There's the children and parents, that category, in verses 1 through 4. And then the next category is 5 through 9 in the category of even servants and masters. But if you notice, it goes from those who have to submit to then those who are in authority over. And both of them have to be kept in check, and they have to submit to one another as well as submit to the Lord in it all. And the definition of submission that I've been giving even last week and now I give even this week is to order yourself under the authority that God has placed in your life and to creatively function within that realm of responsibility and authority to make others flourish for the glory of God. And so the goal there is really in submitting to one another is to love others. Submit to even their needs to help them flourish and glorify God and to help even the body grow. And so you see that admonition that's there. Now notice here, when Paul addresses even the children, it's interesting that he doesn't say, parents, address your children that they need to obey their parents. But actually he says, children, obey your parents. And something I want you to realize here before we get into this passage is that children were assumed to be in the gathering as they were reading the Scripture. And this letter was to be read to the church, and the letter assumes that children are listening. It's a good thing to have children even sit under the preaching and teaching of God's Word, even if they don't quite understand it. I think that's important. And even here, they're being addressed even in a corporate sense. And you know what's interesting is, does any of us really fully understand everything that Paul writes? No. And I think there are definitely certainly times for children to learn even at their level as well, but it's good for them to be challenged and stretched and present even in corporate worship and corporate teachings as well. So good reminders there. But the main idea this evening is that submission or submit to Christ in all situations. Submit to Christ in all situations. You find yourselves in verses 1 through 4, and notice how he goes here. He moves to children. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So you're talking to family here, right? And we could dive into this really deep and go a really long time, but we're going to take a few observations here, and hopefully this will be helpful even as you consider and have your discussion later. But number one, you'll notice that for children, he addresses children first, he says that obedience is right. Obedience is right. It's a good thing. It's a right thing. It's a just thing. Notice what he says. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. The word obey, it's the word for even, of course, under hearing, listening. And the key there is that it's to be in the Lord. How are children to obey? Well, it's supposed to be in the Lord, in fear of the Lord, but also in what is right and just and upright. Right? Children are to obey their parents as long as their parents are telling them to do things that aren't necessarily wrong. And there are a lot of things that parents call children to do that aren't necessarily wrong. So they should be. But if a parent does tell a child to obey in the way that is sinful, well, that's when a child has to then recognize the need to obey God rather than man. But other than that situation, children are to obey because obedience is right, and it's just. Obedience is not only right, it's also commanded. Notice what it says. He says in verse 2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Right? So he kind of goes into the Old Testament and says this is actually commanded that you are to honor your father and mother. We'll talk about honoring in a second, but I want you to see that it's commanded. This is not a negotiable thing. This is you must do this. It's commanded in the Old Testament. It's commanded here. Obey your parents. This is a command. Does that mean, I can obey them sometimes? No, it's all the time. I love saying this thing with in our home. We try to define what is obedience. Obedience is doing what you're told right away with a smile on your face and in your heart. And I think that really catches even what is obedience. It's not just the outward service, but also the inner service of the heart. And you'll see that later as we get even to servants in a moment. But notice he then continues. It's commanded. And notice then he continues and says, honor your father and mother. Well, what does it look like to honor a father and mother? Well, honor means to give weight to recognize value, to set a price for. So it's not just, I need to obey my parents, but I need to honor them. You see, you could obey your parents in a dishonoring way. And here he's saying, no, it's not just obeying them, but it's how you obey them. With giving them value, giving them, respecting them, revering them, recognizing their authority in your life. Is the obedience with the right kind of attitude? Is it with an obedience that has the bad attitude? Then it is not honoring, and thus you're not obeying. What does it look like to honor even your parents as adults? Well, you may not be children, because here it's saying children, which would be teknon, would be those that are ages like ages 2 to 12 or 13, depending on the culture and time, of course. But as adults, we're still called to even honor our father and mother. We show value to them, but even the authority and the structure may look a little different in that situation. But notice he says here, there's a special even promise here, which kind of goes to the next one, that obedience brings blessing. And children, you need to remember that obedience is the path of blessing. It says that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. Right? So there's a blessing that comes from even obeying. It goes well, you live long on the earth. I know children want to live longer. Right? People in general want to live longer. Remember that even Noah obeyed the Lord, and there was a blessing to be able to be on the ark. You can really think of throughout even Genesis. Obedience brings blessing. Abram obeyed, God blessed him. Right? And so, even in that, there's a blessing to obedience. If you disobey, it's a path of, there's no blessing. There's turmoil, there's pain. Doesn't mean you're not a child anymore. No, it just means that you are going to have to be subjected to discipline, right? And so in that, you see, okay, obedience is the right path. It's the good path. It's the blessed path. All right, so then he continues on and he says, okay, now he's turning to parents. Now, for parents, this is really interesting. Notice what he says. He says in verse 4, and you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. I want you to notice first, he doesn't say fathers and mothers, but he says, and you fathers. But earlier he had said parents, or children obey your parents. And then he said, honor your father and mother, right? Quoting even the Old Testament. But here, in you fathers. And I want you to realize this, is that fathers are the final responsibility of the training of children. They're the final responsibility. Fathers are addressed. Why are they addressed? Because the father is the head of the home. If you think about it, go back to even Ephesians 5, where it's the husband is the head of the wife, right? As Christ is the head of the church, and the husband and wife, they lead in the home, but if the husband's the head, if there's wrong conduct in how leading is done, who is accountable? It's the one who's the head. Even if the conduct is done here by the wife wrong, that was done under the leadership of the head. And if the head's not addressing the one who's under them appropriately, who's then leading even the children, that's a problem. Or if the head is not doing what is right, that is a problem. So you can see fathers ultimately have the ultimate authority, or I should say ultimate accountability or responsibility of even training their children. But it's not just even they're accountable in that, but they're accountable in even washing their children in the water of the Word, just like they're washing their wives in the water of the Word. You can kind of see that with even Ephesians 5. There's that responsibility he has here. And then, of course, it says fathers. I want you to think about that, fathers. But number 2, I want you to see Christian parents, or you can say parents. Christian parents, I like to emphasize this, can train their children in the wrong ways. Notice he's addressing Christians. See, sometimes we think, oh, I'm a Christian, everything will be all right. I'll bring the kids to church, I'll read my Bible, do all that. But we can still, even if we try to even train our children to do what is right, we can do it in the wrong way. So that's why he warns, do not provoke your children to wrath. Even if the effort is to do good, there can be much bad that comes for how you approach the training. So, what does it mean to provoke? Well, it means to make angry, to aid in becoming angry, and aid in anger, push someone to even be angry. It's interesting, Colossians 3 kind of has a similar idea. It says, fathers, do not provoke your children. But then he says this, lest they become discouraged. And so you could even say that when a parent provokes their children to even anger, part of that is even discouraging to them. And so the opposite of provoking your children would be encouraging. So the opposite of discouraging would be encouraging. And the opposite of provoking, it would be encouraging your children. Well, how would you encourage your children? Well, one gentleman said it this way. He said, basically, here's some examples of parents that could provoke their children to even anger. Well, number one, not being consistent. Second, blaming. Discouraging for them. That could make them blame. This, always rebuking the child and very praising them. I don't like it when people do that to me. That would be very discouraging. How about even showing favoritism? Or making light of problems that children see as important. Right? So it might be a big deal to them, but then you're just like, oh, that's nothing. Well, that would be frustrating and even discouraging for a child. Or even disciplining in anger. I want you to be mindful of this, is that it's rare for us to live out righteous anger. And so before you justify your anger, you need to examine your anger. And I recommend trying not to be angry while you're disciplining your child. And if you're angry, it's very likely it could turn into, or if it is, likely it is, sinful anger. So do not discipline in anger. This provoking, it can be accomplished not only in doing these things that are wrong, but you can provoke your children to wrath in the way that you try to train them, in your attitude, in the way you bring them up. Now, the next thing I want you to see is that parents are responsible for teaching them about the Lord, teaching their children about the Lord. Parents are responsible for teaching the children or them about the Lord. And you can kind of see this here where it says, okay, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. That first term, bring them up, is really important. It's the same word that Paul uses for for Christ, how he nourishes his bride, and how husbands are supposed to nourish, feed, care for his wife like he cares for and feeds his own body. And so here, parents are really responsible for nourishing their children. When you train your children, do you really nourish them? Or even in the demeanor, are you provoking? Is it not nourishing? And even that. So parents are responsible. Notice here it says, but bring them up or nourish them in the admonition. Two key words I want you to see here. First, training means paideia. It's the Greek word, it is the Greek word paideia. It's a strategy of teaching, a system of training children, a culture or a way of doing it. For example, the Greeks had a paideia, a way of training children that was different than maybe the barbarians, how they trained, the paideia of their ways, or the paideia or the system of training that even the Hebrew schools had for children. They had their own methods or system of training. So the parents are responsible for teaching their children about the Lord. It's not the church's responsibility, it's the parents' primary responsibility, and the church can come and aid. But who is most responsible? Think about it. 1 hour a week at church, or 2 hours or 3 hours a week, versus the hundreds of hours. I think it's hundreds. Yeah, for the hundreds of hours of training that can happen at home. Think of Deuteronomy 6, right? As you walk along the way, as you rise up, as you sit down, as you eat your meal. And of course, that training is really important. So there's the training, and then the admonition, which is the word nouthesia. We get the word nouthetes, which is kind of the idea of even giving counsel to place in mind, to admonish, even rebuke in some senses. And so there should be a rebuking, but if your training is only rebukes without intentional teaching, there's problems. If our training is only discipline, in other words, for example, spanking or something like that, if that's the only thing that they get, the only kind of training they get is that, and they don't get any instruction, what picture does that show of them of even God's even authority in their lives? It should be a better picture. But then it continues on. I want you to think about this. It says, training admonition of the Lord. You see, is your training, here's a good question, is your training Christ-oriented? And that the most important thing to them should be their relationship with Jesus Christ. Not sports, not school, not all these things. Those are important, but what's most important? And is that portrayed in your time, your energies, your efforts? What do you choose to sacrifice in order that your children would learn of the Lord? Will you sacrifice time with the body of believers or time in the Word for other things? Or will you sacrifice those other things for time with the body of believers and in the Word? See, even sacrificing other things for prayer and those different things. Are you training your children so that they are pushed in a direction of the Lord? And I want you to think about this too, going back to even encouraging. Don't let the only thing your child gets from you is a correction. There's teaching, encouragement, appreciation, thankfulness. Here's a good even wisdom that I learned from somebody, is that encourage your child 10 times more than correcting them. Not that you should stop correcting them and maybe the areas that they need to be corrected. Maybe there needs to be wisdom in that. But don't relinquish your correction where it's necessary. But add encouragement in areas where it's more than necessary, or more than just the bare minimum. Encourage them. Encourage them. Now, what I want you to do is take a moment. I want you to pause the video because we're going to shift now into then submission even in the workplace. But I want you to take a moment, read verses 5 through 9 together, and I want you to do two things. First, I want you to observe, mark the places where it says as. Remember we did this last week with even connecting with Ephesians 5:1 where it says, be imitators of God as dear, be like God. And so now, I want you to mark the places where it says as in verses 5 through 9. And then the second thing, I want you to look at what is it that we are supposed to know? Kind of thinking about how be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Okay, what is it we're supposed to know? And mark the as. What are the similarities, the similes that we're supposed to have in our actions as we interact with even in the workplace? So, I hope that exercise was good. And here's some even, you'll see that there's 4 as's that at least I wrote down. You can see it in verse 5. In sincerity of heart, as to Christ. In verse 6, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Right? And then it goes into even then masters in that as well. But then the things that are to know. You see that down in verse 8 where it says, knowing whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same reward. And then, of course, in verse 9, knowing that your own master who also is in heaven. I want you to hear these principles here as we even finish up even this passage. For servants or even workers, number one, we need to remember that God is your ultimate master. God is your ultimate master. Now, I want you to think about this. Bondservants, it's a term, it's literally the term for slaves. And when we think of slaves in our culture, we often think of the slave trade and back in our history and where people didn't have any value or rights or anything like that. But back in these days, they had rights. Some people could own property. Some people were able to get a wage of some sort. They had protection. Some people voluntarily became a slave because they would be fed, they'd be paid well, and they'd be educated. And so it's a very different way of thinking than in our culture. And it's also an institutionalized thing. And I would say that it's not that Paul didn't say, he did not say revolt against the master. Instead, he says, servants, be obedient to those who are your masters. Now, it wasn't that he's saying that, that slavery is a good thing, but he wasn't saying that that's our main goal, is that we should do these social things. I think the gospel has social implications, and it can affect the things, but the main focus is how are we going to live godly in the context we have, and then allow the gospel to change our culture and our system and a way of thinking. And that's what even Paul did, even as he preached the gospel, that did change the ways of even slavery in the past. But I want you to see that you remember, notice what he says here, remember who your master is, that God is your ultimate master. And you see this down in verse 5. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. Now, why do you say according to the flesh? And I think it's because when you're in Christ, who is your ultimate master? It's the Lord. You think of even 1 Corinthians. I am not my own. I've been bought with the Christ. With a price. Ooh. I've been bought with a price. I've been bought with Christ. But Christ, and so we are to glorify God with our bodies. We are His master. And so spiritually, we have a master. When we weren't in Christ, we had a slave master, and that was even Satan the devil. It was our enemy, and he was a terrible master. But now, he's saying, Christ is your master. Serve these masters according to the flesh. In other words, Christ is your spiritual master, but according to the flesh, you might have fleshly masters in your life. You might have fleshly authorities. You can equivalent even this position of even bondservants to today would be the closest comparison would be somebody who works in the workplace. So, but responding to this authority, those who are I want you to think about that. You have fleshly masters, but who is the ultimate master? Remember, Christ is your ultimate master. He's the one. Obey. You can see that in the very bottom. As to Christ, right? Obey Christ is really the ultimate comparison and connection there. Next, you say respond. This is the next principle. Respond to authority like it is Christ. Notice, he says, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, in verse 5. We're supposed to fear and tremble the Lord. And we're supposed to have sincerity of heart. Real, like not just a external service, but a realness of our heart in approaching even, this is Christ who knows my heart. And so he's saying, as you obey your masters, treat them as if it is you're serving Jesus Christ. Think of that with your boss. Do you view it like that with your boss? Or do you just try to go to the bare minimum? And that actually goes to the next point. Reject half-hearted service. Reject half-hearted service. Notice what he says. Not with eye service. Right? Things that people see. Like doing what looks good to others, but then when no one's looking, what is your actions? What are your actions? And do they honor the Lord as you act? Notice it says, not with eye service as man-pleasers. There's another as there. But as bondservants of Christ. Doing the will of God, not just externally, but where? From the heart. Joyful, hearty service to God by doing what is glorifying to God. When you respond to your boss, do you joyfully and willfully choose to obey and honor them in the workplace, as long as it's a good and God-glorifying thing, right? It's got to be just and right. But are you responding in a way that it's as if Jesus was the one that was there, since Jesus gave them that authority? All authority is from God. All right. Next is, of course, you see that, and you can even see with the connection of even goodwill service, doing the will of God from the heart with goodwill, doing service as to the Lord, not to men. In other words, benefiting even your master, your boss, in a way that would benefit them, so that the Lord is glorified. Then you notice it says, ruminate on the reward. That's the next one. Ruminate on the reward. Ruminate on the reward. You can look down even to the verse 8. It says there's something to know. What are you supposed to know? Know that there is a reward for the good that you do when you seek to help others flourish for God's glory. Right? When we seek to submit, there's a reward for that. Know that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Since most of us aren't necessarily slaves, still we're free. This would apply to us. And then he goes to verse 9, for masters, and I'll just cover these very briefly. Notice it says, and you, masters, do the same things to them. In other words, what are the same things? Seek the benefit of those under your care. Just like how servants are supposed to seek the benefit of the master. They're supposed to do what is good. They're supposed to seek to submit to the master of the Lord, joyfully do all those things. Masters, those who are bosses, those who are in authority over others, they should seek to the benefit those who are under them. So, just think of it like that. Secondly, stimulate obedience through value. Notice what it says. Giving up threatening. Now the word for threatening there has this idea of anger or intent to hurt or harm someone. And masters in those days would actually have the ability to even execute people or torture people who weren't obedient. And so instead of encouraging people to obey through threats, we're supposed to use our even leadership. A good leader would encourage people by valuing their life instead of devaluing people's lives. Instead of saying you're insignificant, so obey, it's no, you are significant, so please do obey. And then finally, serving your ultimate master. Notice that he says, knowing that, and here's the motive for why, your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. I want you to think about this. The best leaders or bosses or masters are those that remember that they are under God's authority. Not just like, I'm an authority and there's nothing else, but they recognize, oh no, I'm under God's authority. I must behave rightly as I am accountable. And those who are tyrants are usually those who don't realize that they are accountable, that they have an ultimate master. So, submit to Christ in all situations. I encourage you to engage in some discussion. I went through this passage relatively quick, a quick overview. There's so much more you can dive out of this, but I encourage you, go back through the passage, dive in, meditate on, chew on, wrestle